This version of the events of 1692 in Salem was included in Robert Calef's More Wonders of the Invisible World, although its writer is listed as anonymous. Since Calef has credited everything else in his book that he did not write, we should assume this was not written by him. The account itself is fair, but as we would expect, biased in favor of the accused. How could it not be? One does not have to embellish the acts of those in authority to show the thumb on the scale of justice. The afflicted girls, the ministers and the magistrates have no redeeming characteristics. They are truly omnipotence without intelligence, evil equaled only by foolishness. Neither do the accused require any exaggeration. Their dignity and courage in the face of death is behavior worthy of emulation without dressing it up. With no further ado, here is
an impartial account of the most memorable matters of fact, touching the supposed witchcraft in New England. Mr. Parris had been some years a minister in Salem village, when this sad calamity, as a deluge, overflowed them, spreading itself far and near. He was a gentleman of liberal education, and not meeting with any great encouragement, or advantage in merchandising, to which for some time he applied himself, betook himself to the work of the ministry. This village being then vacant, he met with so much encouragement, as to settle in that capacity among them. After he had been there about 2 years, he obtained a grant from a part of the town, that the house and land he occupied, and which had been allotted by the whole people to the ministry, should be and remain to him, etc. as his own estate in fee simple. This occasioned great divisions both between the inhabitants themselves, and between a considerable part of them and their said minister, which divisions were but as a beginning to what immediately followed. It was the latter end of February 1692, when divers young persons belonging to Mr. Parris's family, and one or more of the neighborhood, began to act, after a strange and unusual manner, viz. As by getting into holes, and creeping under chairs and stools, and to use sundry odd postures and antic gestures, uttering foolish, ridiculous speeches, which neither they themselves nor any others could make sense of. The physicians that were called could assign no reason for this. But it seems one of them, having recourse to the old shift, told them he was afraid they were bewitched. Upon such suggestions, they that were concerned, applied themselves to fasting and prayer, which was attended not only in their own private families, but with calling in the help of others. March the 11th. Mr. Parris invited several neighboring ministers to join with him in keeping a solemn day of prayer at his own house. The time of the exercise those persons were for the most part silent, but after any one prayer was ended, they would act and speak strangely and ridiculously, yet were such as had been well educated and of good behavior. The one, a girl of 11 or 12 years old, would sometimes seem to be in a convulsion fit, her limbs being twisted several ways, and very stiff. A few days before this solemn day of prayer, Mr. Parris's Indian man and woman made a cake of rye meal, with the children's water, and baked it in the ashes, and as is said, gave it to the dog. This was done as a means to discover witchcraft, soon after which those ill-affected or afflicted persons named several that they said they saw, when in their fits, afflicting of them. The first complained of, was the said Indian woman, named Tituba. She confessed that the devil urged her to sign a book, which he presented to her, and also to work mischief to the children. She was afterwards committed to prison, and lay there till sold for her fees. The account she since gives of it is, that her master did beat her and other ways abuse her, to make her confess and accuse such as he called her sister witches, and that whatsoever she said by way of confessing or accusing others, was the effect of such usage. Her master refused to pay her fees, unless she would stand to what she had said. The children complained likewise of 2 other women, to be the authors of their hurt, viz., Sarah Good, who had long been counted a melancholy or distracted woman, and one Osborne, an old bedrid woman, which 2 were persons so ill thought of, that the accusation was the more readily believed, and after examination before 2 Salem magistrates were committed. March the 19th, Mr. Lawson, who had been formerly a preacher at the said village, came thither, and hath since set forth in print an account of what then passed, about which time, as he saith, they complained of Goodwife Cory, and Goodwife Nurse, members of churches at the village, and at Salem, many others being by that time accused. March the 21st, Goodwife Cory was examined before the magistrates of Salem, at the meeting house in the village, a throng of spectators being present to see the novelty. Mr. Noyes, one of the ministers of Salem, began with prayer, after which the prisoner being called, in order to answer to what should be alleged against her, she desired that she might go to prayer, and was answered by the magistrates, that they did not come to hear her pray, but to examine her. The number of the afflicted were at that time about 10, viz. Mrs. Pope, Mrs. Putnam, Goodwife Bibber, and Goodwife Goodall, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, and Dr. Griggs' maid, and 3 girls, viz. Elizabeth Parris, daughter to the minister, Abigail Williams his niece, and Ann Putnam, which last 3, were not only the beginners, but were also the chief in these accusations. These 10 were most of them present at the examination, and did vehemently accuse her of afflicting them, by biting, pinching, strangling, etc. And they said, they did in their fits see her likeness coming to them, and bringing a book for them to sign. Mr. Hathorne, a magistrate of Salem, asked her, why she afflicted those children. She said, she did not afflict them. He asked her who did then. She said, I do not know, how should I know? She said, they were poor distracted creatures, and no heed to be given to what they said. Mr. Hathorne and Mr. Noyes replied that it was the judgment of all that were there present, that they were bewitched, and only she, the accused, said they were distracted. When the accused had any motion of their body, hands or mouth, the accusers would cry out, as when she bit a lip, they would cry out of being bitten. If she grasped one hand with the other, they would cry out of being pinched by her, and would produce marks. After the hearing, the said Cory was committed to Salem prison, and then their crying out of her abated. March the 24th, Goodwife Nurse was brought before Mr. Hathorne and Mr. Corwin, magistrates, in the meeting house. Mr. Hale, minister of Beverley, began with prayer, after which she, being accused of much the same crimes, made the like answers, asserting her own innocence with earnestness. The accusers were mostly the same, Thomas Putnam's wife, etc., complaining much. The dreadful shrieking from her and others was very amazing, which was heard at a great distance. She was also committed to prison. A child of Sarah Goods was likewise apprehended, being between 4 and 5 years old. The accusers said this child bit them, and would show such like marks, as those of a small set of teeth upon their arms. As many of the afflicted as the child cast its eye upon, would complain they were in torment, which child they also committed. The said Mr. Lawson being to preach at the village, after the psalm was sung, Abigail Williams said, now stand up and name your text. After it was read, she said, it is a long text. In sermon, he referring to his doctrine, Abigail Williams said to him, I know no doctrine you had, if you did name one I have forgot it. Ann Putnam, an afflicted girl, said, there was a yellow bird sate on his hat as it hung on the pin in the pulpit. March 31st, 1692 was set apart as a day of solemn humiliation at Salem, upon the account of this business, on which day Abigail Williams said, that she saw a great number of persons in the village at the administration of a mock sacrament, where they had bread as reed as raw flesh, and red drink. April the 3rd. Being sacrament day at the village, Sarah Cloyes, sister to Goodwife Nurse, a member of one of the churches, was, though it seems with difficulty prevailed with to be, present, but being entered the place, and Mr. Parris naming his text, John 6 verse 70. Have not I chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil? For what cause may rest as a doubt whether upon the account of her sisters being committed, or because of the choice of that text, she rose up and went out. The wind shutting the door forcibly, gave occasion to some to suppose she went out in anger, and might occasion a suspicion of her. However, she was soon after complained of, examined and committed. April the 11th. By this time the number of the accused and accusers being much increased, was a public examination at Salem, 6 of the magistrates with several ministers being present. There appeared several who complained against others with hideous clamours and screeching. Goodwife Proctor was brought thither, being accused or cried out against, her husband coming to attend and assist her. The accusers cried out of him also, and that with so much earnestness, that he was committed with his wife. About this time, besides the experiment of the afflicted falling at the sight, etc., they put the accused upon saying the Lord's Prayer, which one among them performed, except in that petition, "Deliver us from evil." She expressed it thus: "Deliver us from all evil." This was looked upon as if she prayed against what she was now justly under, and being put upon it again, and repeating those words, "Hallowed be thy name," she expressed it, "Hallowed be thy name." This was counted a depraving the words, as signifying to make void, and so a curse rather than a prayer. Upon the whole it was concluded that she also could not say it, etc. Proceeding in this work of examination and commitment, many were sent to prison. May 14, 1692. Sir William Phipps arrived with commission from their Majesties to be governor, pursuant to the new charter, the ancient charter having been vacated by King Charles. May 31. Captain John Alden was examined at Salem, and committed to Boston prison. The prison keeper, seeing such a man committed, of whom he had a good esteem, was after this the more compassionate to those that were in prison on the like account, and did refrain from such hard things to the prisoners, as before he had used. At examination, and at other times, 'twas usual for the accusers to tell of the black man, or of a spectre, as being then on the table, etc. The people about would strike with swords, or sticks at those places. One justice broke his cane at this exercise, and sometimes the accusers would say, they struck the spectre, and it is reported several of the accused were hurt and wounded thereby, though at home at the same time. The justices proceeding in these works of examination and commitment, to the end of May, there was by that time about 100 persons imprisoned upon that account. June 2. A special commission of Oyer and Termine, having been issued out, to Mr. Stoughton, the new Lieutenant Governor, Major Saltonstall, Major Richards, Major Gidney, Mr. Waite Winthrop, Captain Sewell, and Mr. Sergeant, these, a quorum of them, sat at Salem this day, where the most that was done this week, was the trial of one Bishop alias Oliver, of Salem, who having long undergone the repute of a witch, occasioned by the accusations of one Samuel Gray. June 15. Several ministers in and near Boston, having been to that end consulted by His Excellency, expressed their minds to this effect, viz., that they were affected with the deplorable state of the afflicted, that they were thankful for the diligent care of the rulers, to detect the abominable witchcraft, which have been committed in the country, praying for a perfect discovery thereof. But advised to a cautious proceeding, lest many evils ensue, etc., and that tenderness be used towards those accused, relating to matters presumptive, also to privacy in examinations, and to consult Mr. Perkins and Mr. Bernard, what tests to make use of in the scrutiny, that presumptions and convictions ought to have better grounds, than the accusers affirming that they see such persons, spectres afflicting them, and that the devil may afflict in the shape of good men, and that falling at the sight, and rising at the touch of the accused, is no infallible proof of guilt, that seeing the devil's strength consists in such accusations, our disbelieving them may be a means to put a period to the dreadful calamities. Nevertheless they humbly recommend to the government, the speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious, according to the direction given in the laws of God, and the wholesome statutes of the English nation, for the detection of witchcraft. This is briefly the substance of what may be seen more at large in cases of conscience, and one of them, since taking occasion to repeat some part of this advice, Wonders of the Invisible World, declares, notwithstanding the dissatisfaction of others, that if his said book may conduce to promote thankfulness to God for such executions, he shall rejoice, etc. The 30th of June, the court according to adjournment again sat, 5 more were tried, viz., Sarah Good, and Rebecca Nurse, of Salem Village, Susanna Martin of Amesbury, Elizabeth Howe of Ipswich, and Sarah Wilds of Topsfield, these were all condemned at sessions, and were all executed on the 19th of July. At the trial of Sarah Good, one of the afflicted fell in a fit, and after coming out of it, she cried out of the prisoner, for stabbing her in the breast with a knife, and that she had broken the knife in stabbing of her. Accordingly a piece of the blade of a knife was found about her. Immediately information being given to the court, a young man was called, who produced a haft and part of the blade, which the court having viewed and compared, saw it to be the same. And upon inquiry the young man affirmed, that yesterday he happened to break that knife, and that he cast away the upper part. This afflicted person being then present, the young man was dismissed, and she was bidden by the court not to tell lies, and was improved, after as she had been before, to give evidence against the prisoners. At the trial of Rebecca Nurse, this was remarkable that the jury brought in their verdict not guilty, immediately all the accusers in the court, and, suddenly after all the afflicted out of court, made an hideous outcry, to the amazement, not only of the spectators, but the court also seemed strangely surprised. One of the judges expressed himself not satisfied, another of them as he was going off the bench, said they would have her indicted anew. The chief judge said he would not impose upon the jury, but intimated, as if they had not well considered one expression of the prisoners when she was upon trial. Accusers induced the jury to go out again, after their verdict, not guilty. They found the bill, and brought her in guilty. After her condemnation she was by one of the ministers of Salem excommunicated, yet the governor saw cause to grant a reprieve, which when known, and some say immediately upon granting, the accusers renewed their dismal outcries against her, insomuch that the governor was by some Salem gentlemen prevailed with to recall the reprieve, and she was executed with the rest. August 5th. The court again sitting, 6 more were tried on the same account, viz., Mr. George Burroughs, sometime Minister of Wells, John Proctor, and Elizabeth Proctor his wife, with John Willard of Salem Village, George Jacobs Sr., of Salem, and Martha Carrier of Andover. These were all brought in guilty and condemned, and were all executed August 19th, except Proctor's wife, who pleaded pregnancy. Mr. Burroughs was carried in a cart with the others, through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech for the clearing of his innocence, with such solemn and serious expressions, as were to the admiration of all present. His prayer, which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer, was so well worded, and uttered with such composure, and such, at least seeming, fervency of spirit, as was very affecting, and drew tears from many, so that it seemed to some that the spectators would hinder the execution. The accusers said the black man stood and dictated to him. As soon as he was turned off, Mr. Cotton Mather, being mounted upon a horse, addressed himself to the people, partly to declare that he was no ordained minister, and partly to possess the people of his guilt, saying that the devil has often been transformed into an angel of light, and this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. He was dragged by the halter to a hole, or grave, between the rocks, about 2 foot deep, his shirt and breeches being pulled off, and an old pair of trousers of one executed, put on his lower parts. He was so put in, together with Willard and Carrier, one of his hands and his chin, and a foot of one of them being left uncovered. John Proctor and his wife being in prison, the sheriff came to his house and seized all the goods, provisions, and cattle that he could come at, and sold some of the cattle at half price, and killed others, and put them up for the West Indies, threw out the beer out of a barrel, and carried away the barrel, emptied a pot of broth, and took away the pot, and left nothing in the house for the support of the children. No part of the said goods are known to be returned. Proctor earnestly requested Mr. Noyes to pray with and for him, but it was wholly denied, because he would not own himself to be a witch. September 9th. 6 more were tried, and received sentence of death, viz. Martha Corey of Salem Village, Mary Easty of Topsfield, Alice Parker and Pudita of Salem, Dorcas Hoare of Beverly, and Mary Bradbury of Salisbury. September 16th, Giles Corey was pressed to death. September 17th, 9 more received sentence of death, viz., Margaret Scott of Rowley, Goodwife Red of Marblehead, Samuel Wardwell, and Mary Parker of Andover, also Abigail Falkner of Andover, who pleaded pregnancy, Rebecca Eames of Boxford, Mary Lacey, and Anne Foster of Andover, and Abigail Hobbs of Topsfield. Of these 8 were executed, September 22, viz., Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Anne Pudita, Margaret Scott, Wilmette Red, Samuel Wardwell, and Mary Parker. Giles Corey would not put himself upon trial by the jury, they having cleared none upon trial, and knowing there would be the same witnesses against him, rather chose to undergo what death they would put him to. In pressing his tongue being pressed out of his mouth, the sheriff with his cane forced it in again, when he was dying. He was the first in New England that was ever pressed to death. Mary Easty, sister also to Rebecca Nurse, when she took her last farewell of her husband, children, and friends, was, as is reported by them present, as serious, religious, distinct, and affectionate as could well be expressed, drawing tears from the eyes of almost all present. It seems besides the testimony of the accusers and confessors, another proof, as it was counted, appeared against her, it having been usual to search the accused for tests, upon some parts of her body, not here to be named, was found an excrescence, which they called a tet. After execution Mr. Noyes turning him to the bodies, said, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." In October 1692, one of Wenham complained of Mrs. Hale, whose husband, the minister of Beverley, had been very forward in these prosecutions, but being fully satisfied of his wife's sincere Christianity, caused him to alter his judgment, for it was come to a stated controversy, among the New England divines, whether the devil could afflict in a good man's shape. It seems nothing else could convince him, yet when it came so near to himself, he was soon convinced that the devil might so afflict. Which same reason did afterwards prevail with many others, and much influenced, to the succeeding change at trials. October 7th, Edward Bishop and his wife having made their escape out of prison, this day Mr. Corwin the sheriff, came and seized his goods, and cattle, and had it not been for his second son, who borrowed £10 and gave it him, they had been wholly lost. The receipt follows, but it seems they must be content with such a receipt as he would give them. Mr. Philip English, and his wife having made their escape out of prison, Mr. Corwin the sheriff seized his estate, to the value of about £1,500, which was wholly lost to him, except about £300 value, which was afterward restored. After Goodwife Hore was condemned, her estate was seized, and was also bought again for £8. About this time a new scene was begun. One Joseph Ballard of Andover, whose wife was ill, and after died of a fever, sent to Salem for some of those accusers, to tell him who afflicted his wife. Others did the like. Horse and man were sent from several places to fetch those accusers who had the spectral sight, that they might thereby tell who afflicted those that were any ways ill. When these came into any place where such were, usually they fell into a fit, after which being asked who it was that afflicted the person, they would, for the most part, name one whom they said sat on the head, and another that sat on the lower parts of the afflicted. Soon after Ballard's sending, as above, more than 50 of the people of Andover were complained of, for afflicting their neighbors. Here it was that many accused themselves, of riding upon poles through the air, many parents believing their children to be witches, and many husbands their wives, etc. When these accusers came to the house of any upon such account, it was ordinary for other young people to be taken in fits, and to have the same spectral sight. Mr. Dudley Bradstreet, a justice of peace in Andover, having granted out warrants against, and committed 30 or 40 to prisons, for the supposed witchcraft, at length saw cause to forbear granting out any more warrants. Soon after which he and his wife were cried out of, himself was, by them, said to have killed 9 persons by witchcraft, and found it his safest course to make his escape. A dog being afflicted at Salem village, those that had the spectral sight being sent for, they accused Mr. John Bradstreet, brother to the justice, that he afflicted the said dog, and now rid upon him, he made his escape into Indian country, and the dog was put to death, and was all of the afflicted that suffered death. At Andover, the afflicted complained of a dog, as afflicting of them, and would fall into their fits at the dog's looking upon them, the dog was put to death. A worthy gentleman of Boston, being about this time accused by those at Andover, he sent by some particular friends a writ to arrest those accusers in £1,000 action for defamation, with instructions to them, to inform themselves of the certainty of the proof, in doing which their business was perceived, and from thenceforward the accusations at Andover generally ceased. In October some of these accusers were sent for to Gloucester, and occasioned 4 women to be sent to prison, but Salem prison being so full it could receive no more, 2 were sent to Ipswich Prison. In November they were sent for again by Lieutenant Stevens, who was told that a sister of his was bewitched. In their way passing over Ipswich Bridge, they met with an old woman, and instantly fell into their fits, but by this time the validity of such accusations being much questioned, they found not that encouragement they had done elsewhere, and soon withdrew. And now 19 persons having been hanged, and 1 pressed to death, and 8 more condemned, in all 28, of which above a third part were members of some of the churches in New England, and more than half of them of a good conversation in general, and not one cleared. About 50 having confessed themselves to be witches, of which not one executed, above 150 in prison, and above 200 more accused. In the trials, when any were indicted for afflicting, pining, and wasting the bodies of particular persons by witchcraft, it was usual to hear evidence of matter foreign, and of perhaps 20 or 30 years standing, about oversetting carts, the death of cattle, unkindness to relations, or unexpected accidents befalling after some quarrel. Whether this was admitted by the law of England, or by what other law, wants to be determined, the executions seemed mixed, in pressing to death for not pleading, which most agrees with the laws of England, and sentencing women to be hanged for witchcraft, according to the former practice of this country, and not by burning, as is said to have been the law of England. It may here be further added concerning those that did confess, that besides that powerful argument, of life, and freedom from hardships, and irons not only promised, but also performed to all that own their guilt, there are numerous instances, too many to be here inserted, of the tedious examinations before private persons, many hours together, they all that time urging them to confess, and taking turns to persuade them, till the accused were wearied out by being forced to stand so long, or for want of sleep, etc., and so brought to give an assent to what they said, they then asking them, were you at such a witch meeting, or have you signed the devil's book, etc., upon their replying, yes, the whole was drawn into form as their confession. But that which did mightily further such confessions, was their nearest and dearest relations urging them to it. These, seeing no other way of escape for them, thought it the best advice that could be given, hence it was that the husbands of some, by counsel often urging, and utmost earnestness, and children upon their knees entreating, have at length prevailed with them, to say they were guilty.
When Sir William Phipps went to the eastward, it was expected that his absence would be prolonged to the 12th of October. Writing on the 14th, he says, that before any application was made to him for the purpose, he had put a stop to the proceedings of the court. He probably signified, informally, to the judges, that they must not meet on the day to which they had adjourned. It is likely that Phipps, while at the eastward, had received some communication that hastened his return. We know that the lives of 20 people had been taken away, one of them a minister of the gospel. 100 were in prison, about 200 more were under accusation, including some men of great estates in Boston, the mother-in-law of one of the judges, Corwin, and a member of the family of Increase Mather, although, as he says, in no way related to him. A magistrate, who was a member of the House of Assembly, had fled for his life, and Phipps's trusted naval commander, a man of high standing in the church and in society, as well as in the service, after having been committed to jail, had escaped to parts unknown. More than all, the governor's wife had been cried out upon. We can easily imagine his state of mind. Sir William Phipps was noted for the sudden violence of his temper. Mather says that he sometimes showed choler enough. Hutchinson says that he was of a benevolent, friendly disposition, at the same time quick and passionate, and, in illustration of the latter qualities, he relates that he got into a fight with the collector of the port, on the wharf, handling him severely. When his lady told her story to him, and pictured the whole scene of the strange ferment in the domestic and social circles of Boston and throughout the country, it was well for the Chief Justice, the judges, and perhaps his own ministers, that they were not within the reach of those blows, with which, as Mather informs us, in the life of Phipps, the rough sailor was wont, when the gusts of passion were prevailing, to chastise incivilities, without reference to time or place, rank or station. But, as was his wont, the storm of wrath soon subsided. His purpose under the circumstances was, as the result showed, unalterable. He communicated to the judges, personally, that they must sit no more, at Salem or elsewhere, to try cases of witchcraft, and that no more arrests must be made, on that charge. But the witchcraft delusion was far from over.